her record. Noam gained national prominence by refusing to shut down South Dakota during the height of the COVID pandemic, which at one point had the highest per capita death rate, the third highest in the world. Recently, in her memoir, she was caught fabricating meetings with world leaders like North Korea's Kim Jong-un and France's Emmanuel Macron. And she's currently banned right now today by 9 Native American reservations, which account for 20% of the land in her state, for speaking outright lies about drug cartels operating on those reservations. And of course, in her own words, she admitted to shooting her own dog because she couldn't train it properly. News that was so shocking and offensive even inside the MAGA bubble that it appeared to tank her chances of becoming Trump's VP. That's where we start the hour with former Trump White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews. With us at the table, NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff. He's the executive producer of the film Separated, based on his book of the same name. It is about mass deportations and family separation that took place during the first Trump presidency. Also at the table, political columnist, host of the podcast In Politic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman is back. I start with you and the serious belief among Trump's voters and supporters that this will happen. Just give me a sense of how many people he successfully deported the first time and how much larger the operation will be that Kristi Noem will now be responsible for this time.
Simply put, less than Obama, who deported more people than any president in the history of the United States presidency. And let me back up and say again what we said when we talked last week. Mass deportation is family separation by another name. There are millions of people who live in the interior of this country who have undocumented family members, maybe as many as 20 million. And so what Kristi Noem is going to have to do is make the decision that Kirstjen Nielsen, who comes to mind in this moment, made when she was presented with a stark choice by members of the political operation of the Trump administration, namely Stephen Miller and other people who pushed this policy. Would she sign a memo like Kirstjen Nielsen did? Option 3 was the memo for family separation, to deliberately deport people that are intertwined with the lifeblood of the country, people who are in our schools, in our churches, in our places of work, who are our neighbors, who make the economy go in this country every single day. And most importantly, is she willing to stomach the blowback that this country saw, that the world saw, unilateral, not bipartisan, but sort of universal condemnation, including the Pope, to something that separates families in the interior, and that is exactly what they are proposing. I know they're saying sort of felons, not families. That was the Obama line, actually, back when he deported more people than any other president in history. Are they just going with the Obama plan, or are they going to go further? I'm very curious to hear from this administration about the particulars and the practicalities of this. And now that's on Kristi Noem, who, by the way, I don't know how many people she managed in South Dakota. Maybe it was 10, 15,000 as the governor. The Department of Homeland Security has 260,000 employees. Is she prepared for that? Is she ready for that? That's a question that she's going to have to answer.
Sarah, DHS is a relatively new government agency. It was propped up after 9/11. It does have, though, the highest profile events that happen in this country. And for someone as vain as Donald Trump has proven to be, who might take pride in pulling off an Olympics or a World Cup, what does it signal to you that someone with no, again, we looked at her record, we didn't find any obvious experience with events of that scale really ever happening on her watch? What for you explains this pick?
I think that it all comes down to loyalty. Like you noted, her record, she doesn't have any background in national security or law enforcement that you would typically see to choose someone to head up this agency. And the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is a vital one. It's vast. It covers things like you mentioned, from FEMA to Secret Service falls under DHS. And obviously there's been failures at Secret Service right now. And then the border crisis, something that Donald Trump ran on, that was a key part of his campaign, and why I think you saw people switch to support him in this election. And to imagine that she's going to be in charge of all of those things is a little bit alarming. And I think it's been telling, too, that even MAGA world, there's been some pushback on this selection. I think that not everyone is necessarily thrilled with her selection. She turned off a lot of people, even those within MAGA world, with when she was pushing her memoir and told the story about killing her puppy because she couldn't train it. And so I think it's worth noting that Kristi Noem has killed more animals than any Haitian migrant in Springfield, Ohio ever has. But to imagine that she's going to be in charge of this agency is a little bit alarming. But I think some of Trump's other cabinet selections, even if I think someone like a Marco Rubio is spineless, I think that he's more than qualified to be Secretary of State. Whereas I don't know if people can say the same about Kristi Noem.
John, let me show you some reporting from my colleague Julia Ainsley at NBC News. She writes this: Noem has a close relationship with former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski, and he has given her political advice during her career. One source familiar with the decision to pick Noem as DHS secretary said Lewandowski may join her with a senior position inside DHS, possibly as her chief of staff. This is Corey Lewandowski on child separation, as Jacob described it during the first Trump term.
I mean, look, I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome being taken from her mother?
Pick anything you want up at the
Heading to the top of DHS.
So many things to say.
We got 2 hours, baby.
I mean, you know, I think for a lot of people, I know for those of us who love our dogs, that was it and you know, it's interesting, of course, Donald Trump, the former president, future president, who has no use for dogs. Not surprised, maybe not a coincidence that he doesn't find that terribly off-putting in her selection. I think there's no doubt, the following things are all true, that the mass deportation plan is this Trump 2.0's version of Build the Wall, and it's the highlights, the banner headline, long promised during the campaign for years. He's been talking about it. It's also the case that, unlike building the wall, the political risks entailed are much higher. A serious attempt to mass deport 20 million undocumented immigrants from this country would require the federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement to do nothing but that. And the first time something went wrong, which it would quite soon, where a kid got shot, somehow something, you know, rounding up people and putting them in cages, putting them in trucks, trying to get them out of the country on that scale, the risks of a high-profile catastrophe, human catastrophe happening that would backlash against Donald Trump pretty quickly are very high. Also, the business community in America is not for this policy. This is a huge number of people who are, I say this cynically, but it's just a fact, who are cheap labor for American business. So there's a certain amount of deportation that the business community will tolerate. On a mass scale that Trump has talked about in certain cases, there would be a huge backlash from a lot of big American companies. Again, people that Donald Trump does, in fact, care about to some extent. There is a question in my mind about, so what is the scale of this going to be? And how much of it is going to be a Potemkin thing designed to look as though there are mass deportations happening when there are not, in fact, mass deportations happening. And I will say that among the many things that are both curious and extraordinarily disturbing about Donald Trump's relationship with Elon Musk, one of them is, in the same way that Twitter/X got turned into a propaganda, misinformation, disinformation machine for Trump in the campaign, I think we all have to be very careful and very vigilant in our business to make sure that that platform and associated other platforms aren't being used either to minimize or exaggerate the degree to which this policy is in fact being affected as we go forward. I can talk about this all day long.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I have some friends who are students of this subject. One of whom I saw yesterday in Chicago, a woman named Jory Craig, who is brilliant and has been studying the right-wing information loops in a serious way for a couple decades. And her comment to me yesterday was, there's a way in which this could be done. Like, look out for the possibility that this will be done for show, that the social networks that want to that want to amplify Trump's message will claim that it's taking place on a larger basis than it really is.
Like wag the dog.
Sorry?
Like wag the dog.
Yeah, a little bit in the way, yes. That was not the phrase she used, but the notion that with Elon Musk and the Joe Rogans of the world coming out and saying, man, this is really great, we're getting rid of all these illegals, that it will be rage bait for the left, and the right will all go crazy because they think it's all great. And in fact, the numbers may not, and I'm not trying to let Trump off the hook, it could be the other way. You know, we could also see it minimized. But the questions of what is actually happening on the ground, this is one of the great challenges for journalism in this era. This is a very, very challenging policy to implement, and it could either be minimized or exaggerated, and we have got to make sure that we know what's actually going on when they try to do whatever it is they're going to do on this front.
I just think we have to be very careful. I think it very well could turn out that way, that they don't end up, because practically speaking, they can't deport 20 million people from the United States of America. But remember, John Kelly, at the time, that Secretary of Homeland Security, sat up there in front of Congress and said, I can't imagine any other reason than to separate families than the parent was a criminal, there was something wrong with the mother and father, and the child was in danger. And then they went on to do what Physicians for Human Rights called torture. According to the UN definition, American Academy of Pediatrics called it government-sanctioned child abuse. What I learned covering family separation, and they surely talked a big game about it. First, they said they were going to do it. Then they pretended like they weren't going to do it. Ultimately, they went through with it. If they say they're going to do something, at least in this instance, they went through with it in a way I don't think that we've ever seen so far, that the George W. Bush appointed judge who stopped the policy had said this was one of the most shameful chapters in the history of our country. And don't take my word for it. One day, I hope it's not us talking about it. I hope it's the 5,500 kids, bless you.
Excuse me, made me sneeze.
who were taken away from their parents that tell that story, that it's the American citizen families
100%.
Who were deported during the Bracero program, after the Bracero program in 1954, who were deported in that operation from Dwight D. Eisenhower that had a name so racist that we shouldn't say it on television. They do these things when they say they're going to do them. At least that's the pattern that we have seen so far. They just have to figure out how they're going to do it. And the people that are in there right now, Tom Homan, who executed the family separation policy, Stephen Miller, who executed the family separation policy, you know, I don't think these guys do things for show.
I want to be really clear. I'm not saying don't worry about it. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that the lever of power that Trump now has with the richest man in the world controlling one of the central communications platforms in this area allows for that platform to be used for either to minimize what's really going on or to exaggerate what's really going on, depending. And my only point is not to say, let Trump off the hook if nothing bad's going to happen here. It could be horrible, and it could be worse than anything we've ever seen. It could also be a fraud. Or both in some cases. And my main thing is, as we sit here today, speculating on what's going to happen, the only thing that's important, I think, for our business is that we have to be on the ground, in the field, and being vigilant and being clear about what is actually happening in whatever direction it relates to the rhetoric.
Let me bring you in on this, Sarah. I mean, I think that as we look at the sweep of the swing states, we look at the signs that were proudly carried. Mass deportations was, I think, the sign most closely associated with the 4 days of the convention. We look at the lengths Trump went to double and triple and quadruple down, even against the pleas from Republican governors and mayors after the lie about eating the dogs and the cats in Springfield, Ohio. I just want to introduce another dynamic into this, and that is the much ballyhooed Infrastructure Week, which Trump teased every Wednesday, Thursday of a preceding week, and it never happened. And that was largely due to incompetence and an inability to sort of line up the cars in a 3-car parade. Do you see a different level of competence in his ability to marshal the federal government and bend it to his will this time?
I do think that during a first Trump term, he was learning how government operated. And I think now going